Thank you very much once again. This evening we're looking at our second lecture on manage sustainability in organization. So we are covering learning outcome 2. We should be able to, at the end of this lecture, be able to apply legislations, regulations, and guidance on sustainability to any organization. Right. In our lecture, our last lecture, we looked at the concept of sustainable development, and it was evident from Agenda 21 that sustainable development simply means using our resources, being natural resources, be fiscal resources, be financial resources, without compromising the future generations, their chances of using the same resources. So when we want to produce, manufacture, or provide any service in a sustainable way, it means we're trying to exploit it without compromising or jeopardizing the chances of our future generations using the same resources. Right. So the objectives for lecture 2 is to help us analyze legislations, regulations, and guidance on sustainable development issues. At the same time, to be able to evaluate the relevance of legislation, regulations, and guidance to sustainability of a specific organization. And then 3, to be able to explain the application of sustainable development legislation, regulation, guidance on a specific organization. It's not enough just to bring in legislations, in other words, laws and regulations, if we are not able to apply it. So we'll first look at some key legislation that came out as a result of the concept and the principles of sustainable development. Right. So in this lecture, the key thing that we do are legislations, regulations, and guidance. Because without them, corporations will not adhere to the principles of sustainable development. We have so many organizations who exploit either physical resources, human resources, or any physical resources without thinking of replenishing it. So if we take the fisheries sector, for instance, without sustainability, big ocean trawlers will be used to scrape the ocean floor, exploit all the fishes in such a way that the habitat of the fishes will be destroyed, the fish stocks will deplete because young and very small fishes will be catch. Their spawning grounds or their breeding grounds will be destroyed. So a time will come where the fisheries will be no more. That is selfish way of exploitation of resources, which is not sustainable. So the whole idea of sustainable development concept came into being so that at the same time that we are able to exploit the resources for our own benefit, we will also cater for the need of future generations for them to be able to use the same resources and then leave some for their generations unborn as well. That is sustainable development. Now, we know that organizations are actually profit-oriented. That means that without any laws and regulations, they will go on exploiting in an unsustainable way. So out of the Rio Conference on Agenda 21, so many regulations have been in place, but the extent to which these are abide by or adhere to is a different issue. But we'll try the best as we can to be able to understand the key legislations that is in place at the moment, to try and evaluate whether they are relevant or not, and then we explain the way such legislations are applied so as to enhance sustainability in terms of the use of natural resources. Right, so let's look at the next slide. Over recent years, governments, particularly those in the Western world, have come to realize that changes have to be made if the situation is to improve. In terms of ocean resources, fisheries, the rate at which they were being exploited was unsustainable. So there was the fear that most of the fisheries will just break down. We have a clear example of fisheries in the Newfoundland, in North America, which actually collapsed entirely because fishes were fished in an unsustainable way that there were no more fish stocks for the fishermen. So in the collapse, and that was an eye-opener for government to start realizing that if things are not done in a sustainable way, then you're going to have problems. Therefore, they have to put in laws. If you look at forest resources, vast amounts of forests are now being cleared for the production of soya as a main source of protein for feeding farm animals. At the same time, livelihood of indigenous local population are also being destroyed forever. At the same time, we can also say that the ecosystem imbalance is coming to place because there are so many animals that depend on the forest. So if we exploit them in an unsustainable way, there will be imbalance in the ecosystem. Apart from that, it might have serious environmental consequences in terms of pollution. If you look at oil resources, it's the same. The rate at which barrels and barrels of oils are drilled every day, and the way the environment are polluted have all become problems that government have started thinking about. If nothing is done, we'll get the oil, but we'll destroy the land and we'll destroy the oceans through pollution, so that people's livelihood, especially indigenous people, will lose their livelihood. If they are farmers, they will lose their trade. At the same time, if they are fishermen, where they fish will be destroyed through pollution. Their farmlands will be destroyed. So these are all issues. Besides that, there's vast environmental pollution. The environment is degraded. So government has the need for the situation now. To that change of legislation has been introduced, and there promised to be a greatness. You're going to have more and more laws and them strict adherence to those legislations. The whole concept of the Indian subcontinent and part of China, because of rapid destruction, so much pollution, at some time about a lot of respiratory is affecting people around the world. land problems. These are issues come to and over the world, countries come out of in the place. That's what the environmental protection countries all over the world are embracing the concept of environmental protection. So this act contains 164 sections, arranged in 9 parts, and it's a massive piece of legislation covering a great variety of topics. Environmental Protection Act. The 3 key areas are summarized as Part 1 contains integrated pollution control and local authority air pollution control. This section focuses on preventing and reducing the release of substances into the environment. So if you look at the City of London, for instance, there are congestion zones which has been created. Why? It's just because of what? The massive vehicular air pollution. And there is so much noise about electric vehicles, electric cars, and then the phasing out of petrol and diesel cars. So these are all part of the integrated pollution control and local authority air pollution control. So the air quality is constantly monitored and measured. So this Part 1 focuses on preventing and reducing the release of substances into the environment. And many manufacturing organizations are forced to make sure they will be able to capture all those carbon that are released into the atmosphere, that which is called carbon capture. These are all measures that have come for preventing and releasing substances which are harmful into the atmosphere. So even though organizations are meant to make their own profit, their profit cannot be made at the expense of health of current population and the population unborn. Right. So that is about integrated pollution control and local authority air pollution control. Part 2 look at waste on land. This section put a prohibition and an unauthorized or harmful deposit, treatment, or disposal of waste, placing a duty of care on the organization to prevent escape of harmful substances. Waste on land. There is so much unsustainable production to the extent that so many organizations, factories are depositing their waste product on land. This is becoming a problem. Even in the UK, fly tipping has become a problem. So legislation under the environmental protection is making flight tipping a punishable offense. Why are they doing that? They are doing that to prevent waste on land. Waste on land. So at the moment, if you fly tip any waste, even household waste, that is punishable by law. That is punishable by law. So you could see that waste on land is a key part of the Environmental Protection Act. So that part put a prohibition on unauthorized or harmful deposit, treatment, or disposal of waste. Right, placing the duty of care on the organization to prevent escape of harmful substances. Right. So you can't just release any pollutant into the atmosphere. Organizations are charged to be responsible to make sure that you don't dispose waste on land as well as in the atmosphere. Part 3 is statutory nuisance and clean air requires the local authority to regularly inspect the area and to deal with problems such as smoke, fumes, dust, smell, noise, and animals. So you can see that the Environmental Protection Act is very broad. And this is all meant to make sure that corporate bodies behave responsibly. This is part of corporate social responsibility, all geared towards sustainable development, because we want to develop in such a way that we will use the resources, leave the resources, benefit from them, and leave them from our children and our grandchildren and then unborn generation to come. So the Environmental Protection Act came as a law or legislation which support sustainable development. All right, let's look at the next slide. We have the Environmental Act. This act was instrumental in creating the Environmental Agency. It deals with air quality, water quality, contaminated land, and waste. So this is another legislation in 1995. So a whole organization or agency has been tasked. That is the Environmental Agency. So when the environmental legislation was brought in, a whole agency has to be established. And the act establishing it was the Environmental Act 1995. So the Environmental Protection Agency, Environmental Agency has been created with the sole role of checking air quality, water quality, contaminated land, and waste. So any organization or any production unit or any business organization that go contrary to the law is dealt with. Right. So that is the Environment Act 1995. Let's look at the next slide. Next slide. The name see quite long. We and Ross. We and Ross. The name is quite long, but we will explain that. The we is simply the waste, electrical, and electronic equipment. The waste, electrical, and electronic equipment. We. This directive came into force in January 2007 and was amended in 2010. In fact, all the legislation keep on changing when new issues or problems begin to come out. So even though the we was in 2007, it's been amended in 2010, and to keep on updating to take care of unforeseeable issues that crop out. This directive aims to both reduce the amount of electrical and electronic waste being produced and encourage everyone to reuse, recycle, and recover it. In fact, many organizations, electronic companies in particular, are making huge profit. But the problem is as to whether those corporate organizations are making the profit and then harming future generations, their ability to live. We've now got a lot of sites in developing countries where piles and piles of waste, electrical and electronic equipment have been dumped. And this cannot go on because it pollutes the environment, creates sickness and diseases, destroy the land, and some of the waste find their way into the oceans, causing pollution. Therefore, all organizations and businesses by law have to make sure if there's any electronic equipment, they will be reused over and over and over again to reduce waste. At the same time, some of them could be recycled into other items and then recover it. So the we is to make sure that corporate organizations behave in the responsible way and to make sure that any waste that they pass out onto consumer is recycled, reused, or should be recoverable. Now we know a lot of plastic which has just ended into the ocean, killing the ocean ecosystem, where fishes are dying, the breeding ground of fishes are being destroyed, and these plastics are going to be in the ocean for thousands of years because they are not biodegradable. So the we is a legislation which will help to make corporate bodies, organizations responsible so that all their waste will be reused, recycled, and recovered. Let's look at ROS. It's a directive on the restriction on use of certain hazardous substances in electrical or electronic equipment. The regulations limit the use of hazardous substances such as lead, cadmium in the manufacture of new electrical and electronic equipment released on the market anywhere in the European Union. Right, and here it's so sad that it's the European Union. What about the rest of the world? Probably the United States have got its own equivalent. But what about India and China, which keep on using lead and cadmium in manufacturing? How do we deal with it? Because they will manufacture it and send their goods all over parts of Asia and Africa. So the problem is not actually solved. But then, at least in the European Union, ROS directive is enforced in a very strict way so that lead and cadmium will not be used by manufacturing companies. This boils down to the issue of corporate social responsibility. Every organization must be responsible and make sure that they don't use these substances in the first place. And when they are used, sanctions has to be applied to organizations. As far as the goods are placed anywhere within the European Union and the UK, this is a very strict regulation. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We've looked at we and ROS. Let's look at the next slide. There are 8 categories of items which covered by the we and ROS directives, which we want to look at briefly. These are large household appliances. This could be refrigerators, deep freezers, washing machines. These are large household appliances. What about small household appliances? Electric irons and blenders. What about ITs and telecom equipment? Telephones, computers, and the rest. There are other consumer equipment like hand dryer, and the rest, basic things that are all manufactured Then we have general electrical and electronic tools, power tools that are used. What about toys, leisure, and sports equipment? And then we also have medical devices. The wheels and rolls covers all those items that are being manufactured. Therefore, an attempt to be made in such a way that all these items listed will be reused, recycled, and recovered. You will find a lot of toys being used in the developed world, being sent as second-hand goods all over Africa, all over Asia, and being left all over without any proper legislation. So the use of such things are not sustainable for the planet. Right, let's look at the next slide. So at least we know some of the items, some of the 8 categories of items which are covered by the we and raw. So you can't dump any of these ones anyhow. Right. The next slide. What are the main objectives of the we directives? It requires producers of electrical and electronic equipment to finance at end of life. Finance at end of life. It means that all producers must make sure that after the item has passed its useful life, it won't just be dumped anyhow, but there will be arrangement for collecting all those used items, and then follows treatment. The treatment will be either recycling, reusing it, or recovering it. So they have been given targets that they have to meet. Percentage of the items that go out and the percentage that are recycled, reused, or recovered. This is very, very important. Some countries are advanced, whereas some are not. In a country like Norway, over 20 years, they were actually recycling all their bottles because the manufacturers will make sure that if a can of Coke is 1 Norwegian krona, they will sell it 1.20 Norwegian krona. So that as soon as you drink it and you send the bottle back to the shop, you get your 20.20 krona back. This has been used for a long time. That is why in Scandinavia, especially Norway, the environment is very clean because they have embraced and understood the concept of sustainable development. So manufacturers have a key role to play if such legislations are going to succeed. So there should be a collection arrangement, treatment arrangement, and there are targets that need to be met in terms of recycling and recovering. Recycling and recovering. Let's look at the next slide. Environmental Permitting Regulation 2010. Right. The Environmental Permitting Regulation England and Wales 2010 were introduced on 6 April 2010 and actually replaces the 2007 regulation. And these regulations cover the storage, the treatment, transport, and disposal of hazardous waste. Waste is considered to be hazardous when it might be harmful to human health or the environment. The emphasis is on human health or the environment. Right. So this regulation, Environmental Permitting Regulation, focuses on what? The storage, treatment, transport, and disposal of hazardous waste. So all such waste must be stored in a secure way. Number two, it must be treated in a good way. And then, after collection, it needs to be transported and then disposed in an environmental friendly way. So there are a lot of recycling plants trying to recycle everything and then reuse it or dispose it in a friendly way that will not contaminate humans or the environment. So waste is always considered to be hazardous when it might be harmful to human health or the environment. So let's take note of the environmental permitting regulation, because you should be able to list legislation, look at how, analyze it, and look at how it can be applied. That's why I've taken my time in explaining. Look at the legislation, what it contains, analyze it, and look at how it can be applied. Right. The next slide, the waste framework directives. So there are so many directives. So there are several directives issued by the European Union which must also be adhered to. One key example is waste framework directives. This one requires member states to ensure that waste is recovered or disposed without endangering human health and without using process and methods which could harm the environment. This clearly shows that waste, plastic waste, cannot just be incinerated. You can't burn it, because if you burn it, it's against the waste framework directive. Because one, it will come out with fumes that will harm human health, at the same time will also harm the environment. So one key example is the Waste Framework Directive, which requires member states to ensure that waste is recovered or disposed of without endangering human beings and without using process and methods which could harm the environment. In many places like China and parts of Africa and Asia, such waste are often burned. People try to pick up some metals and electrical equipment and waste dumps, whereby their actual physical health is harmed. Apart from that, those waste seep into water tables where water is being drawn, and it seeps into rivers and lakes, which cause a lot of harm to humans. It also goes into the atmosphere, which affect our breathing and cause a lot of diseases and problems all over the world. So the Waste Framework Directive is one of the key ones that is meant to protect the environment. Those all come about because we want organizations to produce in a sustainable way. Let's look at the next slide. In fact, climate change is a huge subject. It's a huge subject. And recently we heard President Obama making a lot of noise about the Climate Change Act, that he doesn't believe in it, that the environment is changing, climate is changing through natural dynamics. But many critics of President Obama knows that what he's saying is wrong because of what? Scientific evidence. So the Climate Change Act 2008 made the UK the first country in the world to have a legally binding long-term framework to cut carbon emission, which is quite laudable. It set out the government commitment to reduce the UK's carbon emission by 80% by the year 2050. That's quite an ambitious target. It's an ambitious target. Right. So You could see that, and there's a lot of laws coming in. There's a fear that within the next few years, petrol and diesel cars will be off the road as electric cars are replacing. There are so many buses, state coach buses that are running on green energy. These are all signs. Congestion zones that have been placed all over London and big cities in the UK are all evidence that the UK government is actually serious about reducing carbon emission by 80% by the year 2050. So I expect you to argue all these things out when you are analyzing the application of the legislation in your assignment. Right. The Act introduces the concept of carbon budget. A carbon budget places a restriction on the total amount of greenhouse gases the UK can emit over a period of 5 years. The UK is the first country to set legally binding carbon budget. Right. Under a system of carbon budget, every ton of greenhouse gases emitted between now and 2050 will count. Where emission rises in one sector, the UK have to achieve corresponding fall in another sector. So if the transport sector is exceeding its emission, it should be reduced by maybe emission in the manufacturing sector to offset the deficit. So the UK is quite serious on climate change. And these are all to make sure that there is sustainable development in the UK and across the world. The Climate Change Act, which is a very popular and controversial one. Let's look at the next slide. Energy Savings Opportunity Schemes. Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. Again, under the EU legislation, it became mandatory for almost 14,000 UK companies to complete an initial audit of their energy usage. These companies affected are from the private and the third sector only and must employ at least 250 staff or have an annual turnover of more than 42.5 million. The public sector organizations, in this case, are not affected. So look at that. 14,000 companies using energy saving stuff. Right. And they just say it for the sake of saying it. They make sure they audit it. Right. So it's mandatory for companies to complete an initial audit of their energy usage. The audit, which for most part are carried out by third parties, will result in energy saving recommendation, implementations of which is optional. They recommend, but the implementation part of it is what? Optional, as far as the ESOS is concerned. Now, there are energy saving bulbs, electric bulbs, which are being used, energy saving boilers, energy saving washing machines, energy savings televisions, energy saving cars, blue tech, whereby you use the car, if you're in traffic, the engine is shut down, and if you start moving before you can use energy again. So these are all energy saving techniques. And out of that, the audit involves looking carefully at how an organization uses energy. We should consider how energy is used in the buildings, in the transport, and in industrial operations. In the building, they make sure that the building is insulated very well. So the government has spent so much money on what? Insulation, even in houses. So that once you heat your room, the heat will remain in the room for quite a long time. That is a way of saving energy and saving our planet. That's all part of sustainable development. So all corporate organizations have to make sure that they have energy saving buildings. So all new buildings have this insulation in place to be able to save energy as compared to the big, huge Victorian buildings that are quite difficult to save energy. Then energy saving opportunity scheme is also in transport, as I already mentioned. Energy savings. We go on to electric, apply the blue tech, whereby the engine will cut off in traffic so that you don't continue to emit. And then in all industrial operations, machines and all power tools are now energy saving devices that will not use more energy. Right. So that is ESOS, Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, which is it's under a EU legislation. It's now mandatory for 14,000 companies in the UK. And as long as you are employing more than 250 staff, you must comply. All right. Let's look at the next slide. Some phases. 1. All affected organizations should have complied with the requirement for phase 1 by 5th December 2015, which has already passed. ESOS phase 2 is now underway, requiring further audits and reporting, and despite the uncertainty over Brexit, there is no indication at the current time that the triggering of Article 50 will affect the requirement of ESOS program. Compliance with phase 2 must achieve by 5th December 2019. So we are years to 2018. But as has been said, we don't know the implication of Brexit, whether Britain will have a different idea from that of the EU. So that is yet to come. So you should be able to analyze it and bring in the two phases and the implication of Brexit in your analysis. Right. So let's look at the next slide. We come to organizations, their role that they need to play in sustainable development. So look at corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. So if you ask yourself, what is corporate social responsibility? What is corporate social responsibility? Corporate social responsibility, environmental issues are now a major concern for all organizations. You can't just make your profit at the absence of the environment, making your profit at the absence of the environment. No, that is not sustainable. You have to make sure that you produce, you manufacture, you provide service in such a way that you make profit, but then your profit motive shouldn't jeopardize the chances or the opportunity of future generations to also benefit from duration. So corporate social responsibility and environmental issues are now a major concern. So Apple cannot just be making the iPhones without looking at environmental consequences of old, unused Apple computers and iPhones. They should be responsible. They have to make sure that all their products are reused, recycled, or recovered. They have a role to play. So profit motive is not the whole issue. So as facility managers, we have a huge amount of influence on corporate social responsibility concern. So if you are a manager in a hospital or in the care home, you have a duty to make sure you sustain the environment for development. So what is CRS, which is corporate social responsibility? What is it after what I've explained? Let's look at the next slide. We're trying to look at the link between corporate social responsibility and sustainability. Of course, there's a big link. So CSR is simply corporate social responsibility. Responsibility towards staff responsibility towards the environment, everything. They have to be responsible for their employees, their welfare, everything. If you're producing in a polluted environment, it's going to affect the health of your employees. It will pass on through the offsprings of children of the employees who are not born. So organizations, corporate bodies should be responsible even for the health of their own staff. They should be responsible for the environment. You have to make sure that they don't produce and pollute the environment as they pocket their profit. So even their production should be in a sustainable way, taking into consideration the sustainability of the planet that we live on. So corporate bodies must be responsible. That is all about corporate social responsibility. And it's linked to the environment. It's linked to the environment. So corporate social responsibility and sustainability are terms that are often used interchangeably, but there is a distinct difference. As facility managers, it is important that we understand that difference. We should understand the link between CSR and sustainability. Of course, when we operate, we are corporately socially responsible, then that will lead to what? Sustainable production or sustainable environment. Let's look at the next slide. We are finishing very soon. Let's look at 6 pieces of health and safety legislation facility managers need to know. The world of facility management is dominated by legislation. Ensuring legal and regulatory compliance is one of the core functions of firms, of all facility managers. The world of facilities management is dominated by what? Laws or legislation. Ensuring legal and regulatory compliance is one of the core functions of all facilities management. So if you are a health and safety manager, if you are a facility manager, or a factory manager, or a hospital manager, or a manager of school, whatever, all facilities, hotels, whatever, you have to make sure that there are legislation and legal requirements for us to be compliant. So the 6 pieces of health and safety legislation facility managers need to know. Then you are not up to date. This is also linked with corporate social responsibility. So health and safety legislations are quite key, right? And as FM managers, we are responsible. So this is all part of sustainability, health and safety issues. There are so many legislations that will promote the health of all staff and individuals. I think we've gone a long way looking at the concept of sustainable development. As I said, is sustainable development is more or less producing the current generation, producing, manufacturing, providing service in a sustainable way that we don't compromise with the health of unborn generation. And we have looked at so many legislations that we need to understand. So, or if you look at the beginning of the regulation or guidance of sustainable issues, evaluate how relevant they are. So if you look at the we or the ROS, are they relevant? How is it applicable to your organization where you are working? Explain how such legislation are applied so that we'll be able to have what? Sustainable development. So this lecture, we've been able to cover 3 key assessment criteria, which I think will help you in doing your assignment. Thank you very much for joining in. If you are not able to join in, don't worry. You can always play the recording. And if you have any question, you can drop an email for me to know if you have any issues. Right. Thank you very much. We'll meet next Monday and carry on from there. Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye for now. Bye.